It was the annual school picnic, one of those fun events that rolls around every year when faculty and students and staff and friends can all gather together, family can have an enjoyable time together. You know what those picnics are like, hot dogs, veggie hot dogs rather, chips, lemonade, conversation, games. And if it's a good picnic, sooner or later, somebody at the picnic is going to say, hey, why don't we try, and then we'll follow an idea. Well, this is a good picnic. Because after a period of time, sure enough, somebody said, hey, why don't we try? And they came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea. And there were a few takers. They gathered together. They found a car. They had a green hardtop Cadillac, beautiful car. Group of them got in the car, and in the front seat, it was one of those bench seats. Right in the middle of the seat, they put the president of the school, the president of the college. You're going to go with us. They were going to go over to a camp nearby and see if they could get on the grounds of the camp and see what they could find there. See if they could look around for a bit. Now, it just happened that the name of that camp was Camp David. Now, some of you have heard of Camp David. You've heard of Camp David because that's where certain presidents of the United States go when they want to get a bit of a break. Well, this was during the era of President Richard Milhous Nixon. Well, during this era, the camp was there and the Marines were in place. They were guarding the facility. The group got in the car and off they went. Pulled up to the front gate. The Marine was there, stopped them. Somebody in the vehicle said, the president wants to enter of the college. Didn't add that last little piece, just said, the president wants to enter. The Marine leaned down and looked, person in the middle seat, snapped to attention, saluted, clicked his heels, opened the gate and said, please. And they drove through. No sooner did they get through than the president of the college said, we've got to get out of here. Find the quickest place you can make a U-turn. We've got to get out of here. Too late. The Secret Service descended on them. Now, how did the Secret Service know? The Secret Service knew because the Marine at the gate, through the intercom, gave the notice. The president has entered, meaning he had arrived at Camp David. President has entered. Immediately came back the response. What do you mean the president has entered? He's in here taking a nap. So immediately the Secret Service landed at the car, pulled everyone out of the car, basically disassembled the car, trying to figure out what they were doing, and in a sense, disassemble them, trying to figure out who they were, where do you work, what are you doing, what's your education, trying to understand what happened. Well, the president of the college, who happened to be named Dr. George Akers, bore a rather uncanny resemblance to the President of the United States. In fact, someone here today, Milford Harrison, his mother used to be President Akers' secretary. In fact, I would be surprised if there isn't someone here today who was there that day. But in case you weren't, I want to give you an idea of why that guard might have confused the two. So look at your screen and see if you might have confused the two. That's a striking resemblance, uncanny resemblance. And so Dr. Akers and his friends got pulled out of the car. They got questioned. There were no charges pressed. Part of the reason why was that they told those Secret Service officers who landed on them, hey, we didn't say he was the president of the United States. We just said he was the president. And furthermore, we didn't break in anywhere. They opened the gate for us and we drove in. But there was one more piece that was involved in this reality, and I want to read this to you in the words of Dr. Akers himself, who would later speak of this. One more reality, which is the reason why I tell you the story. Dr. Akers would later say, it was obvious that they, meaning the Secret Service, it was obvious that they were so embarrassed by it that they wanted to find a way out. They wanted to keep it out of the press. In other words, let's just let this be our little secret. We don't need to go share this with anyone else that we let you onto the grounds of Camp David. Let's just make that our little secret. Well, as is obvious by the fact that I'm telling you this story so many years later, it didn't stay a secret. Because secrets are hard to keep. Have you noticed that? It's really tough to keep a secret. That's why Benjamin Franklin said in Poor Richard's Almanac, 3 can keep a secret provided 2 of them are dead. It's just hard to keep a secret. You know that experience when you have a good, juicy secret burning within you and you're trying to keep the look off of your face, but you just can't do it. You're just itching to tell somebody. It's hard to keep a secret. I suppose that's part of why I'm so, what is the word? Bewildered? Befuddled? By what Jesus is doing in the Gospel of Mark. Now, this happens in Matthew and it happens in Luke briefly, but nothing compared to how it happens in Mark. The truth is, when you come to Mark's Gospel, Jesus is trying to keep a secret. I want to take you to several different passages in Mark today, briefly, just so you can get a sense of what it is that Jesus is doing. So we start out in Mark's Gospel, chapter 1. We start out with an encounter that Jesus has with a man with leprosy. So notice what it says, Mark 1, verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately, the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Now, if you grew up in the churches where I grew up, or even if you listen to preachers nowadays, you know what comes after that. Somebody has come to Jesus, has had their life touched, has had their self transformed. They've come down to the altar, they've received him, their life is new. You know what comes next. The preacher says to them, Jesus has entered your heart, he's touched your life, he's changed your experience. Now go and share it. Go tell others. Be sure that you provide a witness. Let your light shine so that others may know. That's what we do. I want you to notice, however, what Jesus did. Mark 1:43. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. What in the world? Can you imagine? Can you imagine Pastor Doug or Pastor Miguel standing in the baptistry, baptizing those wonderful people, and then walking out of the baptistry and saying to them, keep your mouth shut. This will be our little secret. Don't tell anyone. Jesus is trying to keep a secret. But it's not just there. Turn over a couple of pages to Mark 5. Here we enter the story where Jesus has been called by Jairus, one of the leaders of the synagogue. Jairus has said, my daughter is sick, grievously ill. She's at the point of death. So I've sent you these servants to bring you to my house. Come quickly. Jesus is not in any apparent hurry. In fact, so much so that on the way there, he stops for a testimony meeting. Here's the testimony of somebody who's had their life changed, and then he continues on to Jairus' house. It's too late. He took too long. By the time he gets there, the girl has died. Now, Jesus tries to tell them, well, she's not really dead, she's asleep. And Mark says they laugh at him. We know the difference between taking a nap and death. What are you talking about? Well, Jesus gathers together a little cadre of people, mom, dad, a couple of disciples. And I want you to notice what takes place next as he enters the room where the little girl lies. Mark 5:41. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Can you imagine what we would do, what we preachers would do in the middle of a funeral service? The person rises from the dead after a prayer. You know what would happen. People would be racing for the exits, racing to tell the first person they could find. I don't know what's happening in that church, but you won't believe it. We preachers would be standing up here. We would be urging, go tell them God is at work in this church. Bring them. You know what we would do. What does Jesus do? Mark 5:43. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. That is different than anything I ever heard growing up. People's lives being transformed, new life experiences. Preachers never said, shh, keep this between us. And he's not done yet. Go over to Mark chapter 7. This time he encounters a man who is deaf and mute. They bring the man into the presence of Jesus, and Jesus heals him. I want to read it to you, verse 33, Mark 7. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were open, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. I know what I would do. As a preacher, I would say to him, you are now able to hear clearly the proclamation of the good news of the love and the grace and the gospel of God. You can hear it, but you also now have the ability to speak it. So go from this place, share with anyone who will listen exactly what God has done in your life. That's the right thing to do. Mark 7. Verse 36, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. Jesus is having a hard time keeping the secret. People won't honor what he's telling them. In fact, I notice here a rather odd difference between the world of Jesus and my world. When a life is changed, we tell people, go share it, and they don't. When a life is changed, Jesus says, don't say anything, and they do. He can't stop them from talking. They're out there just publishing it abroad everywhere. But Jesus is learning. As we move through the Gospel of Mark, he's catching on to what's happening. One more story. This time, he encounters a man who can't see, a blind man. It's the one time in his ministry he has a two-stage miracle. Touches him the first time, says, can you see? And the man looks around, he says, well, I can see people as trees walking. In other words, I see these blobs of color. I can't see anything distinctly. Jesus touches him again. And now he sees clearly. I want you to notice what the story tells us. Verse 25, once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Jesus is learning. I can't tell these people to be quiet because they go spread it everywhere. So to this man, he says, look, I don't want you on the road. I don't want you on the highway. I don't want you near the village. I don't want you near anyone you know. Don't even go into the village. Go home a totally different way where you won't encounter anyone, because this is not to be told. And I want to ask Jesus, what in the world are you doing? Now, I'm a bit comforted by the fact that there is at least one story in Mark's gospel where he does give permission, in fact, urges the person to go tell. Mark 5 tells the account of the man in the tombstone, among the tombstones in the graveyard. He's demon-possessed, wild, crazy, racing around the place, cut, bleeding. The chains won't hold him. He's scaring the family, scaring the children. Everybody stays away from there. Then Jesus shows up, transforms his life. No wonder the man wants to be, wants to go, wants to follow Jesus. And finally, Jesus says this, Mark 5:18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." He finally gives permission, finally gives direction. Go tell what I have done. But there's just so much else in the gospel that goes in a different direction. It leaves me asking, why? In fact, this is a prominent enough part of the Gospel of Mark that for the last maybe couple of centuries, scholars, New Testament scholars, have had a term they have used to describe it. They call it the Messianic secret. The Messianic secret in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark, is exactly what we've been reading. Jesus utterly changing a person's life and then saying to them, "Shh, don't tell anyone. I don't want this noised around." Our question is why? It's a question that is actually answered at the end of that very first story back in Mark 1 when Jesus heals the man of leprosy, cleanses him, tells the man, "Don't say anything to anyone," and the man goes out and tells everyone. Mark there gives us a clue as to what Jesus is doing. Verse 45, chapter 1. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. So that's what Jesus is doing. He realizes if the word gets out that lives are being changed, I will never be able to deal with all the people that come. Because back in Rome, they have an eagle eye focused on their empire, watching for any place where there might be the beginnings, the birth of an insurrection, waiting to come down on it with the force of Rome's heavy boot to squash it before it starts. Jesus knows if I want to have a chance to really do the ministry I've been placed here to do, the teaching that I need to do, if I have a chance to do that, I have to have time to do as much as possible, in as many ways as possible, for as many as possible, for as long as possible. So please, don't spread it around. Now, what interests me 2 millennia later is the observation of what happens with these people. In fact, it is maybe best stated in one verse, one more verse in Mark, this one in chapter 7, may be best stated in this one verse. 7:24 says, Jesus left that place and went into the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet, he could not keep his presence secret. That's what I learned from the Messianic secret. I learned the fact that when Jesus enters in and changes a life, when he gives sight that one is no longer hindered from seeing the truths of God, when he gives a new heart that beats in our breast, when he restores a family, when he restores a marriage, the reality is you can't keep it secret. You can almost picture Jesus arriving at this house, slipping in the back door and saying to his host, "Shh, nobody, please don't tell them I'm here. Don't let anybody know I'm here." And maybe from the front they said, okay, okay, while out the back door is running every other member of the house, going out and saying, do you know who's at our house? Do you know who's here? Jesus is here. The one who's been changing lives. He's here with us. Come over and see him. He'll change your life. Could not keep his presence secret. I think of these words from the pen of that diminutive woman with a mighty message, Ellen White. One sentence. Think of this. No more could a soul who possesses Christ be hindered from confessing him than could the waters of Niagara be stopped from flowing over the falls. In other words, if Jesus comes to your house, you will never be able to keep it secret. Impossible. In fact, it seems to me as I read Mark's gospel that no matter who tells you to kindly shut up, no matter who tells you, even Jesus himself, if he says, don't tell what I've done in your life, even that won't stop you. Because the change is so dramatic. The peace is so profound. The vision of God is so powerful. You just can't keep it secret. The Messianic secret has me thinking about things. I am so prone, maybe because of what I grew up watching, maybe because of what I've learned over the years, maybe because of a desire and a passion to share with others. I'm so prone to stand up and say, go share, let your light shine, be active in the world for Christ. All of those things, no doubt, have their place. But as I observe what Jesus did with people, if people's hearts were legitimately transformed, you couldn't stop them. You might as well try to stand under Niagara and turn off the faucet. It's trying to stop people where Jesus lives from saying, he's in my house, in my heart. I want to tell you a story. It's a story I love. It's a story I hate. Carrie Oberbrunner, coach, speaker, author, Christ follower, tells of being at the gym one day, the gym where he did his workouts, in the middle of his workout. He noticed a gentleman off to the side with an MP3 player trying to get something to work, apparently. He could tell just the body language, and as he was watching this, man was getting more and more upset and more irate. And finally, Carrie thought, well, I know a little bit about MP3 players. And so he walked over to the man. Having some trouble? Yeah, I'm having some trouble. This thing won't work. This, won't work. Well, Carrie said, well, tell me, you trying to listen to music? He said, well, yes, I'm trying to listen to music. I love jazz music. Can't get it to play on this crazy thing. Well, let me ask you, do you have it on your iTunes account on your computer? The man said, my what? Carrie said, oh, well, maybe there's a little bit more here that we need to do. I want to read you what Carrie says next. He says, this man's name was Bob. He says, against Bob's initial wishes, I visited him at his apartment. Turns out his wife had died a couple of years before, and all his earthly possessions were crammed into a small apartment. She had been their main breadwinner, so the bank repossessed his house when he was unable to make the payments. Bob and I made a makeshift space in his back room near his desktop computer. One at a time, I imported his jazz CD collection onto his hard drive, intending to transfer the MP3s eventually to his player. While importing his music, Bob and I talked about life, about his wife, and about God. The weeks following, I checked in on Bob often. Kind of funny how two guys who are complete opposites can become the best of friends, all because of an MP3 player. Bob is 71, I'm 32. Bob is black, I'm white. Bob doesn't have much money, I have more than I need. Bob is an ex-convict. I've never been to jail. Bob is a widower. I'm married. In short, we're opposites. A short time later, I invited Bob to church, deeply desiring for him to meet Jesus. After a few invitations, he eventually accepted and sat with my wife and me last spring. If he felt awkward sitting in our mostly white church, he didn't let on. After the service, Bob and I knelt near the altar, and Bob told Jesus that he wanted to follow him. Bob confessed that he wanted to stop trying to control his life and invited Jesus to take over. Bob wept, and when I looked into his eyes, I noticed a distinct peace that now defined his face. Bob changed my life and the life of my church. I get more joy from him than he'll ever understand. Whenever I say goodbye to him at the YMCA or hang up the phone after talking with him, he always tells me to give his love to my family. He wants me to baptize him this June at our next baptism. I'm saddened by the reality that I almost missed Bob simply because I was too engrossed in my own little world. I love that story. I love the story of someone who's able to take a step out of his comfort zone. The story of someone who's willing to enter into the need of another person. The story of someone who's willing to make a friendship of that, to follow up. The story of someone who's willing to sit and to talk and engage and build a relationship. The story of someone who is willing to say at an appropriate time, in a winsome way, something about Jesus. You want to come with me to church, Bob? I love the story of someone who's willing to kneel at his side when Jesus comes in and changes his life. I love that story. But I hate that story. I hate that story because it's not my story or yours. I had to follow it up on the internet from somebody I've never met. Somebody who I know through the words on a blog page or a website. It's not my story. It's not your story. I hate that story because I want to stand here and tell you that's my story. That's what happened to me this week. Because Jesus changed my life and because I can't keep that secret, I moved out of my comfort zone. I did something with someone in my life and world. There is someone who has come to Christ, someone in church this morning because of me. That's why I hate that story. Or I want it to be your story. That you come to me, grab me by the sleeve, tears in your eyes and say, Pastor, you'll never believe what just happened this week. I was on a unit seeing a patient, and the story tumbles out. And I stand and listen, and I recognized that Jesus has been at work in your heart, and you couldn't keep the secret. You just had to go share it, didn't you? Because it was burning up within you, so you shared it. And someone found comfort and peace and joy in Jesus. That's the story I want to tell. The story I want to tell is your story and my story and our story. But there's a danger in that. Because the truth is, if you all go out of this place and you start telling people that Jesus is changing lives here, he's doing a remarkable thing, marriages are being healed, lives are being transformed, hope is being found, sins are being washed away in the baptismal waters, I know what's going to happen. You go tell that, we won't know what to do with the people. So maybe it's better that you just not tell it. Just make it our little secret. That way we can keep our group, our club, our clique. We don't have to deal with all the rest of it. Maybe that's better. But I have noticed something about the Messianic secret. I have noticed that it is not so much a question of whether or not we can keep the secret. Some of us are very good at keeping the secret. It's not so much that question. You know what it is? It's this question. Has Jesus done something in my life? Has he done something in my heart? Is he alive and well in my home? Because the truth is simply this. If he's here, if he's there, if he's touched and transformed us, I'd just like to see you try to keep the secret. God of grace, we yearn for a touch from the hand of Jesus. An experience, a true experience of his Spirit stirring in our hearts and in our lives. We yearn for his transformative presence to fill and change us. In fact, Lord, I want to give an opportunity to my friends, my family, a beloved family to me, here at church today. Just a few moments in the quiet and the peace of their own souls to ask, if they dare, Jesus, do a new work in me, a transformative work in me, that not only my heart, my life, but my family, my friends might be touched by the overflow of the Spirit. Lord, you've heard the prayers ascend. You know the hearts that have been opened. You know the requests that have been made. And Lord, we trust you to do your transformative work in our lives. Because when you do that, everybody knows what comes next. In Jesus' name, amen.